Hi, I'm Dirk Norris. I'm the Executive Director of the New Mexico Film Foundation, and I'm here with Director Bill Lichtenstein, virtually, of course, at the George R.R. Martin's Jean Cocteau Cinema. And we're going to be discussing Bill's film, WBCN and the American Revolution documentary, which is just a really fabulous film. If you want to see this film, tickets are available and you can stream it from the Jean Cocteau Cinema, which is jeancocteaucinema.com. Bill, very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
So the documentary is about a unique radio station that got its start in the late 60s. And you were involved, you were actually part of the radio station. You started volunteering when you were like 14 years old.
Yeah, I was in this alternative educational program where they told us all a day a week to go get a volunteer job someplace. So some people called the Red Cross or local, church group or something. And I had been listening to the station, which had just arrived on the scene, and was just really struck by what an amazing thing it was. And so I called them and asked if they needed help. And they had just set up the listener line, which was the phone where they were encouraging people to call with any questions whatsoever. And so I started as a volunteer answering the listener line.
Right.
At age 14.
So tell us about the radio station. What made it unique? What was going on at the time?
You know, it was just, for starters, it really was an egalitarian enterprise. There was no hierarchy there. It was a group of people who collectively made every important decision. There was a general manager who was one of us, and whose job it was not to lose the license. So there were some, lines in the sand. But generally, what ads would be played or the course of the station became something for the subject of discussion of everybody there, from the volunteers, secretaries, announcers. But most importantly, I think it marked a change in broadcasting. Tommy Hadges, who was one of the original announcers, talks about how we were seeing broadcasting less as a performance, radio, less as a performance, and more as a conversation with our listeners, which is not very unusual to think about today, where you turn on NPR and there's this kind of we're all in this together kind of conversational tone.
Sure.
Unheard of in those days. And this idea of having even a conversational tone on the radio was novel. And so it really helped change the course of radio. Music was played. And also, I think because it was in Boston in the midst of 350,000 college students at a critical time in history, not unlike in a lot of ways what's going on today, right. It helped fuel a lot of the great political, social, cultural changes that came out of the late 60s, early 70s.
So you guys had this idea that we're going to have a radio station that's not top 40. It's not, the manufactured. It's going to be something completely different. You're going to play the DJs, and the DJs kind of came from everywhere, right?
Yeah, Ray Reapin, who started the station, it's such an interesting story on its own. He was a Harvard Law student who, as a favor, helped get a lease signed for a building that had been, Unitarian Church, being told that Andy Warhol's film collaborative wanted to open a outpost in Boston. They had money from the Ford Foundation. And so as a favor, he went and signed the lease. And they said, look, we need a check. And he wrote a check on his own bank account and then found out there was no money. And to cover the cost and not go bankrupt, he started playing bands there. And it became the first rock club in America outside of the Fillmore West to bring in rock bands and these great blues artists.
And this is all in Boston?
This was the Boston Tea Party. And he immediately saw the appeal of this music, but that you couldn't hear it on the radio. Mm-hmm. So he dreamed up this idea of having a station that would not only play rock music on FM, which was starting to happen, but would be populated by college students who didn't have radio experience. They intentionally didn't sound like they were radio professionals, but would have a conversational tone.
Yeah.
And so he just drove around Boston and was literally walking in on students on the air at college stations and saying, hi, I'm going to get me a big radio station, and do you want to, come work for me? And as Joe Rogers was the first person I think he did that to, was at Tufts University on the radio, said, this guy walks in, he said, and we laughed and laughed. He said, but he was serious. And suddenly they all found themselves on the air on this 50,000 watt FM station being told you can say anything you want, you can play anything you want. And it was a dramatic change.
And you were kind of at the forefront of a lot of changes. You got involved in women's rights and African American rights and gay lesbian rights and all these things you were kind of at the forefront of all this stuff.
Well, a lot of this was percolating around Boston. For example, the women who became Bread and Roses and wrote Our Bodies Ourselves and became sort of one of the critical parts of the second wave of feminism were in Boston. And they, as a group of people, were listening to the station, which at that point had no female announcers on the air. And it's hard to believe, and one of the things I think that I hope the film does is show young people how much changed during that period and how it changed. But at that point, it was not common for women to be in broadcasting, certainly not on the radio the way they are today. And so the flashpoint was there was a public service announcement for a drug rehab program, drop-in center called Project Place. And in the ad that ran on the air, Charles Laquadera, who is the most evolved, the most PC, and sort of righteous of all the announcers, said, Project Place needs help. If you're a therapist and want to donate some time, call this number. And if you're a chick and you can type, they need help too. And the woman from Bread and Roses in the film recalls almost driving off the road, and saying, we've got to do something. And what they did was they appeared at the station with a box of about 30 baby chicks, live chicks, and dumped them on the general manager's desk and said, those are chicks, we're women, which I think goes to the nature of, protest, it having to be in some ways dramatic and sometimes comical. And the result of it was that they got airtime for what really became the first women's program, which in a lot of ways was like an hour of a women's group of that era talking about the issues that they cared about, many of which are issues today. And BCN ended up hiring 2 and eventually 3 women to be on the air as announcers, which was sort of really groundbreaking at that point.
Yeah, it must have been eye-opening for a lot of you. Things were changing so fast, and there's a sort of parallel to today where you just see these causes that you might care about but feel like, when will this ever be addressed in a genuine way? And suddenly, they're at the forefront of national discussion and progress being made. And I think the difference between those days and now is that there's a kind of tacit acceptance today that we're all working through the system, and a kind of people who have come to the table largely who are protesting, saying, we're here to peacefully protest, we accept the American democratic system the way it is, and we're here to be a part of that and try to make peaceful change through the system. Back then, there was this sense that the system was at the breaking point and that something was going to just explode. It wasn't clear, exactly how, but that we were on the verge of some kind of a youth revolution where young people would really ascend, rise up and sort of take, control of these things in a way that never quite happened. But there was always that kind of sense that we're really on the verge of something revolutionary. But I think similar to today, it seemed like something earth-shaking was happening every day, in terms of, cultural, social, and political changes. And this is an era when Nixon was in office and Watergate and resigning and the Vietnam War was going hot and heavy and all of those protests and burning draft cards and all of that stuff. were you ever afraid at that time?
No, I think the closest I ever came to being afraid was I was in Harvard Square, and while there was a riot going on, and there were police coming up one end of the block and police coming down the other end of the block, and I ended up sort of pushing my way into a dorm doorway into the dormitory and just, hanging out there until it blew over. I think people felt like they had the best interests of the country and they were on the right side of history. And so I don't think there was a lot of fear. I think Kent State shook people up. I think, even with everything that's going on today, that still stands as such a horrific event to realize that you had a group of students on a college campus, sort of, some of them peacefully protesting, some of them, throwing rocks or something at the National Guard, and a lot of them walking to class, and that the National Guard would open fire on those students and kill 4 of them. I think that just became like, this is too much. And I think, we began to feel like we're under fire, but not in a kind of, immediate, I'm at risk. Or I think people who were facing going to Vietnam probably did, because that was such a horrific situation over there, being sent off and not knowing if they, or knowing people who didn't come back, or if they would come back, with some, physical or psychological damage because of it.
Right. When I was in the 6th grade, we moved to Pontiac, Michigan in 1968 when the Detroit riots were going on, and then left after that. But I remember as a kid hearing all that stuff on the news, and it was kind of frightening. Is it going to come here? Are there going to be riots in the streets and burning buildings and that sort of thing? So when you see all this stuff on the news now through the news agencies and on YouTube and Twitter and all of this stuff, I would imagine for some people it's there's not a lot of clarity about what's going on and differentiating the protesters from the rioters. And it can, I think, fear is one of those things that motivates people to do something.
No, I can still remember my parents went out. I was 16, I was 12 years old. And this is before I was working at the station, but they went out for the evening. It was a summer night. And I was flipping around the TV, see what was on. And it was the night that there was the really bad confrontation between the police and protesters in Chicago. Bobby Kennedy had been the presumptive Democratic candidate to run when President Johnson backed out. He was shot and killed. And suddenly we end up with Hubert Humphrey, who was sort of the consummate machine candidate, sort of people who were aware of the Bernie Sanders, Democratic Party situation can understand that dynamic. And so kids said, look, let's go to Chicago and protest. And the mayor of Chicago decided he was going to make a stand, a Democrat, Richard Daley, but make a stand against these kids and basically turn the police loose to beat them. It later was called the police riot. But watching that on TV, and I think, again, there was a sense of that's our generation. It was a kind of commonality among young people. We all had, for the most part, long hair. We wore bell bottoms, gave the peace sign, and these were us being beaten by these policemen. It was a very shocking, moment. And the film opens with this confrontation between the police in Boston and the hippies who had arrived on the Boston Common as the first seed of the counterculture in Boston. And, those moments were very, I think, they were upsetting to people. They were.
Well, let's talk about the film a little bit. I read that you got a lot of resources and a lot of footage from the listeners of the radio station and people that were involved. There was a documentary made here in New Mexico about Meow Wolf, the famous art venue, and I thought it was very fortuitous that so many people had recorded everything that went on from the very beginning. And in a Q&A with the film producers and directors, they said, no, we had to hunt all of that stuff down, and it was a really hard task. And I'm sure that's the same for you, yeah?
Yeah, it was just, there was something about that era I mean, first, we didn't have cell phones, so now anything that happens anywhere, somebody's got their cell phone out. It wasn't that. If even to shoot photographs, I mean, if somebody had a 35 millimeter camera around their neck in those days, they were a serious photographer. The cameras were expensive. The film was expensive. It was expensive to process it. So people weren't just going around shooting photos of things. Cassettes had just been invented in 1970. So before that, to record anything off the air as a listener, you needed a big reel-to-reel machine. But suddenly, there started to be people, especially listeners, recording stuff off the air. I think at the station, there was not a sense that this is a historic moment, we need to record it. And so, in the moment when Jerry Garcia and Dwayne Allman called the station at 1 a.m. and said, we just finished our respective gigs, can we come up and play on the radio? The first thought was not, quick, get some tape, we have to record this. You roll the joint, you record, people just did stuff. And there sort of wasn't a sense of, that kind of the historic nature of it. Bruce Springsteen's first radio interview at age 23, when he came up and played, for an hour on the air and said hello to his mom. And I mean, as amazing as it was, there wasn't the sense that someday, this guy's going to be, well, people sense he was going to be somebody, but not that it should be preserved. So when we decided to do this, a lot of it was reaching out to people, and we were greatly helped by the internet, who had tapes. In part, in those days, so much of this music you couldn't buy at a local record store. There weren't record stores like we have now. At first, you would go to the Five and Dime, and they would have the top 40 records, and maybe if you were lucky, there was a store in your town that sold more esoteric music. But if you heard something on the radio or they were playing something, the only way to have a copy of it would be to tape it off the radio. Right. And so there were people who would just sit and tape for hours and meticulously write down all these songs. So they would build a library of material. They used to have rare tape nights that people would record. So we were fortunate that people shared with us all of their, I think we have 200-300 hours of broadcasts from that period. And also photographers who had taken pictures, who made them available. But it was really, this was the first, we started in 2006 before the word crowd anything had been used. We called it the world's first open source documentary. In fact, if you go to Wikipedia and look up open source documentary, this is the first one that sort of envisioned we can only make this with the help of everybody sharing their stuff, with us.
And your filming technique, you're very hands off of this. You're not narrating anything. You leave it to everybody else that you're interviewing. You don't appear at all. Whereas some other documentary filmmakers are very much involved, and they're on camera interviewing people, and you hear their thoughts and that sort of thing. And I'm sure that's a conscious choice for you. Why is that?
As we were envisioning the film, I can't tell you how many times I thought, or somebody would say to me, there's a kind of almost famous quality to this. And all I kept saying is, look, I'm not going to make a film which starts with like a photograph. In fact, there's a photograph in the office at BCN of the staff, and I'm in the back, The film is not going to start with, in 1970, this was the staff of BCN. There's me, I just thought it was too self-indulgent, and I wanted to tell the story just because I just didn't feel like I wanted to be part of the story. I felt like it would gum it up. And interestingly, in a way, it's almost archival verite. I mean, people are familiar with cinema verite, where you shoot footage, you don't do interviews, and then the story tells itself through that footage, and either you get it or you don't get it.
Right.
And if you miss something, you don't use a narrator to fill in the blanks. Well, in a way, this was archival verite in that we used the strongest archival material we had, where we had both audio and visuals and could tell a story through the various pieces of archive, and then let people fill in the additional information from these interviews. But at the end, the stuff that really was the strongest archival material is what lived. And as an example of what that means, so we're talking about the Boston Tea Party, and what was interesting about the Tea Party was BCN, the radio station, started in the dressing room of the Boston Tea Party because the fuddy-duddies at the classical music station that Ray Reben rented the nighttime hours of to put this on the air had continued on during the day as a classical station. They were mostly Republicans, and they frankly didn't want these long-haired kids coming into their offices at night, worried they'd be smoking or stealing some of the records. So when faced with that, Ray said, well, screw it, we'll just put the station in the dressing room of the Tea Party. So they describe in the film sitting there on the air, and oh, look, there's the Who, or there's the Jefferson Airplane going up and down the stairs to the stage to perform. And oftentimes they would say, come talk. And there were a lot of tapes of that. The Lou Reed at the beginning was from one of those moments. Well, one of the most interesting moments, but we couldn't quite use it because we didn't have enough material, was that the Who was there the day that Tommy came out in America. And Steven Seagal, who's in the film, was on the air and said to them, look, here's the American release. And they hadn't seen the American release, which is a little different than the British cover. Yeah. And they were all, oh, look, it's Peter and Roger and, and John and Keith, come on over. And so they're looking at the album, and Keith is talking about, they're talking about, I'm sorry, Peter rather, is talking about Tommy and what it means, and it was based on the life of this mystic Meher Baba. And Charles Laquadere was there, and he says, so in other words, when he says, looking at you, I find the music, I find exciting, what that really means is he's accepted his role, and Peter's saying, no, that's not it at all. And they're having this in-depth conversation about, the day the record's coming out, what Tommy meant. And first off, we didn't have any photos to go along with it. And it was a very long, as the story is, it was a long conversation. And it was impossible just to get it down to its basic components. So we ended up not using it, as amazing as it was. But one of the things that was interesting is I played it for Norm Weiner, who was there that day. And we were talking about it. He said, people listen to that, and it doesn't seem very remarkable because you can turn on public broadcasting or TV, radio all the time, and there's a musician playing music live and talking about the meaning of the song they wrote. And he said it didn't happen on the radio in those days. Nobody ever had musicians come into the studio and perform and discuss the meaning of their work, and it really was the beginning of that. And so that's
especially those guys. I mean,
remarkable moment, but we didn't, if we had found some photos or something else to allow us to tell the story, it would have worked. So the other way you can fill in, the gaps is to have narration explaining, but we tried to let it, live or die based on the strength of the archival material. And where it was the strongest was where you could get the point of it from the material.
Yeah. Did you run into any problems getting rights to any of the material?
Not problems. We had to clear everything. There was nobody at the end of the day where we couldn't get, get the rights. The visual material was easier. The musical material was, we went through in some cases the standard clearances that you have to go through, and it's a little bit ironic that bands who wrote such anti-materialistic songs and freedom and freedom of speech and power to the people, in many cases they're gone, and the rights to the songs are either sold to or belong to relatives or hedge funds, and they want to get paid. They don't really care about the mission of the film. So, that was the largest sum of money in the production of the film were music rights, just because we wanted to have, the music, have the real thing. And I think it was important to do that.
And it must have been a hell of a job editing.
Yes and no. I mean, the first cut was about literally 8 hours long. I mean, we just laid everything out, and then we kept making it shorter. I think the hardest part was every time we had a section that we realized it just wasn't as good, or we made the point 2 or 3 other ways and lost something. I do have the advantage of we are doing a book for MIT Press, so there's a kind of ancillary outlet for some of the material that didn't make it in the film, we can still, write about it. But, yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's hard because there are things you wish were in there and they're not. And but I think it does tell the story, and always cognizant of trying to tell the story of the '60s, as well.
What do you hope people will take away from this film?
I think one simple thing, and really from the beginning, that's all I really intended was, and it's not even a matter of conservative or liberal or Democrat or Republican, or it's simply if there's something in the world that's really bugging you, that there are ways of changing things, and particularly using the media and the culture is a critical part of that. It's sort of evident now through a lot of what's going on, but when we began the project in the mid-2000s, I think people had forgotten that lesson, and songwriters and artists, and I think as much as it's going on now, I'm sure there'll be a period where things will calm down again and it will be forgotten again. But I think people have it within their grasp to make tremendous changes in the world simply by employing their skills and their voice. And I think media is a tremendously important part of that. And I think media can give voice to people that don't have it. And I think that's really important.
I totally agree with that. If I were king of the world, media literacy would be taught from kindergarten all the way through, because that's so important. And the message you're getting across is that you can use these tools and do something with them. Speaking of which, you're doing something very generous in sharing your film with radio stations, so that they can raise funds. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, we were just starting a theatrical release of the film when the pandemic hit. And so the first thing we did was, theaters have made the film available for rent on their websites in place of it being in the theater. And then, as we would if people were going to the theater to buy tickets, we would split the revenues with the theater. But it occurred to us that somehow we should factor community radio stations into that. So the first few we did kind of partnerships with, we were trying to do partnerships with the theater and the radio station, particularly while the theaters were still open, so that it would show in the theater and the stations would promote it and get a share of the proceeds. And then as things finally got to the point where the theaters were just closing, we reached out to the National Federation of Community Broadcasters, who represent community stations across the country, and said, look, if you want to make the film available on your website, we'll split the revenue with you. It will also help promote a discussion of the importance of community radio and how media can create social change. And then I think what was important, what we heard back was, it was important not just because of, it was a modest amount of funds that was being generated per station, but also just to have something to focus on and be able to talk about the importance of media, especially right now. It's critical. And community media, I think especially, it's just never been more important.
What kind of feedback are you getting from people that have seen the film?
People just love it. I mean, I think from people who lived through that period, a lot of things have been forgotten, and there was a chance to sort of relive a lot of it and put it in context and really see how similar it is to what's going on now. And I think for young people, there are a few things. One is I think young people thought that the 60s, oftentimes from what I've heard, were a time when people smoked a lot of dope and went to a lot of concerts, and then they would go to a protest and give the peace sign. And I think the cultural changes that took place and really the depth and breadth of what went on was not known. I think also where things started for women, for gay and lesbian people, for how repressive the world was in many ways, and what the 60s helped change, I think, is an insight for young people as well. And also just historically, I mean, we showed it at a college, and I remember a young woman said, I'd always heard about Kent State, but I didn't have any idea what it was. And, I think one of the things we wanted to do was, if you watched the film, you would at least understand the arc of how we got from 1960 '67 to Nixon's resignation and sort of the critical moments. And so in a lot of ways, it's the first film that really tells the true story of the '60s, because it follows that sort of simple arc, but kind of puts things into context.
Right.
But there's been, just, unanimously a very solid, positive response to it.
And it's also showing at, you're doing the festival circuit, and there's one in particular you had mentioned.
Coming up?
Yeah.
CineQuest is showing, we actually premiered it there a year ago. The world premiere was there. And I think because of the pandemic, they're organizing additional showings of films. And so CineQuest is going to be showing it coming up, I think, sometime this summer with other films online. And that's in San Jose. It's the big, San Jose festival that pulls in a lot of the .com companies are involved with it. We're also showing it in Middlebury, Vermont is doing a showing of it. So there's still some festival showings going on, and then we moved into theatrical, and then hopefully it'll be on public television next year.
Terrific, wonderful. Well,
video.
Yeah. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to talk about?
No, I just, one of the things I think that's so interesting about the film is the enduring love that people who listened to the station had for that station. I think was beyond anything any of us realized. I've said, I can't think of any other cultural institution from 50 years ago that's gone that gets that kind of response, except maybe the Brooklyn Dodgers. Hey, the Brooklyn Dodgers are people that are like, so Jackie Robinson, and people had that response to BCN, and also people that didn't know the station. I think it's such an interesting unknown story. We showed it, in fact, it was at CineQuest. We showed the film as a world premiere, and Alan Hunter, who was one of the original MTV VJs, moderated the Q&A. One of the original MTV VJs was also J.J. Jackson, who was the first African-American at BCN and is in the film, and had passed away a few years ago. And Alan watched the film, and he came over to me afterwards, and he said, I got to tell you, he said, I'm a rock and roll guy. I know rock and roll. And he said, and JJ used to mention, the station he worked at in Boston. He said, but I had no idea. And then he said twice, he looked at me, he said, Boston, who knew? And, he said, who knew? And there's this body of, history there that sort of fills in a lot of gaps in the 60s about the politicalization of the 60s, about the music. I think it's just an important chunk of history that was never told, and so I'm glad that it was finally told. And the flip side of it would have been that the stuff just somehow drifted off into the ether without anybody memorializing it, and these stories would have been lost. So I'm glad we made the film, and I'm glad it's getting the response it's getting. And I think thrilled that it's coming to the theater there. So hopefully people can have a chance to see it online.
Yeah, I thought it was a really wonderful film myself. And if people want to see it, they can go to the Jean Cocteau website. It's johncocktaocinema.com, and you'll be able to get a ticket to see it. Boy, Bill, this has really been terrific. I really enjoyed talking with you.
No, really appreciate the chance to talk about it. And, thank you.
And good luck with continued good luck with the film, and be safe.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.